Skyscrapers didn't just rise, they competed. Steel, stone ambition stacked higher with every floor. But behind the height was a deeper story. Two cities, two visions. Chicago built first, with grit and function. New York built taller, with drama and shine. This wasn't just an architectural rivalry, it was a battle of philosophies, aesthetics, and identity, etched in skyline. Let's explore how two cities shaped the vertical age and what it cost them. In 1885, Chicago changed architecture forever with the home insurance building. It wasn't the tallest structure ever built, but it was revolutionary in how it stood. It used a steel frame skeleton, which meant the walls no longer had to carry the building's full weight. This simple change unlocked the possibility of building much taller structures. Before this, masonry buildings could only go so high before their own weight became a problem. The home insurance building, though just 10 stories tall at the start, quietly opened the door to the age of the skyscraper. At that time, Chicago was rebuilding after the Great Fire of 1871. Architects and engineers were open to trying new materials and new techniques. There was room to experiment. Steel was relatively new as a structural material in buildings, and fireproofing methods were also evolving. The environment in Chicago encouraged risk-taking and technical advancement. The city's flat geography also meant buildings didn't have to fight for limited land as much as in New York. That helped it become the first home of the skyscraper, but not its lasting capital. New York saw what Chicago did and raised the stakes. If Chicago was about structural innovation, New York turned skyscrapers into a vertical competition. With limited space on Manhattan Island and rising land values, developers in New York had a different motivation. They didn't just want to build efficiently, they wanted to build tall. Tall buildings drew attention. They reflected money, influence, and ambition. This made skyscraper construction as much about branding as it was about practicality. By the early 20th century, New York had absorbed the lessons of Chicago's early experiments and was applying them at a much larger scale. Buildings like the Woolworth Building, 1913, and the Equitable Building, 1915, not only climbed higher, but also influenced how cities regulated building size. The Equitable Building in particular cast such a wide shadow that it led to New York's 1916 zoning resolution. That law required setbacks, steps in the building's form that allowed more light and air to reach the streets below. This regulation didn't stop vertical growth, but it shaped it, leading to the distinctive tiered look of New York skyscrapers for decades. While Chicago continued to innovate, developing the tubular structure that would later support the Sears Tower and John Hancock Center, it didn't chase height with the same intensity. In contrast, New York entered a skyscraper arms race during the 1920s and 30s. This was when the Chrysler Building and 40 Wall Street each claimed the title of the world's tallest building, only to be quickly dethroned by the Empire State Building. These weren't just offices, they were monuments to corporate power. The Chrysler Building even hit a surprise spire inside its tower to steal the height record from its rival at the last moment. This wasn't about function, it was about glory. The race for height had consequences beyond the skyline. Skyscrapers became a symbol of the city itself. They gave form to abstract ideas, ambition, capitalism, modernity. For architects, they were a design challenge. For developers, they were investment tools. For the public, they were spectacles. New York's tall buildings weren't only taller than Chicago's, they carried more cultural weight. The city's image became tied to its towering silhouette. There's also a psychological effect to consider. In Chicago, the skyscraper solved a problem. In New York, it made a statement. This difference shows up in how each city talks about its buildings. Chicago might highlight structure, materials, or engineering. New York talks about stories, power, and scale. The contrast reveals a deeper divide in what each city sees as important. It's worth noting that many architects and engineers moved between the two cities. Ideas were shared. The rivalry wasn't one of isolation. It was a feedback loop. Chicago's John Wellborn Root and Daniel Burnham inspired others. New York's Raymond Hood took those inspirations and pushed them further in his buildings, like the Daily News Building and Rockefeller Center. Talent flowed in both directions. So did innovation. But New York had the greater appetite for building ever higher and the market conditions to support it. Over time, the sheer number of skyscrapers in Manhattan created a dense forest of buildings, unlike anything Chicago had developed. This brought new design challenges: how to get natural light inside, how to handle wind forces, how to maintain the building envelope. Solving these pushed the field forward, again setting the stage for newer breakthroughs like curtain wall systems and tuned mass dampers. The story also includes the city's resilience. When the Empire State Building opened during the Great Depression, it struggled to find tenants and was nicknamed the Empty State Building. Still, it stood. Over time, it filled. It became a symbol of hope, even when the economy didn't support it. New York had committed to vertical growth, and it stayed that way even when the conditions seemed unfavorable. Meanwhile, Chicago focused more on refining its approach to tall buildings. By the 1960s and 70s, it introduced new structural systems, like the bundled tube in the Sears Tower. This let tall buildings be strong and light at the same time. This Chicago innovation would eventually travel to Asia and the Middle East, powering even taller buildings in places like Dubai and Kuala Lumpur. Yet, for all the technical genius coming out of Chicago, it's New York that people picture when they think of skyscrapers. Its vertical ambition became iconic. Films, photography, advertising, and tourism all reinforced the city's image as a place that reaches for the sky. The skyline itself became shorthand for the American dream. Today, the rivalry has softened. Both cities now preserve their architectural heritage while also allowing for new innovation. The torch of tallest has passed to other parts of the world, but the lessons from this early skyscraper war still guide urban design today. Cities learned how to balance vertical growth with human scale. They learned how to regulate sunlight, manage density, and express identity through form. New York and Chicago each made different choices about what skyscrapers should mean. One prioritized origin, the other elevation. Together, they created a model for the modern city, one that sees the sky not as a limit, but as an invitation. Louis Sullivan didn't invent the skyscraper, but he gave it a soul. In the late 19th century, when buildings in American cities were beginning to rise higher than ever before, Sullivan offered something beyond steel and stone. He gave architects a way to think about what these new structures meant. His famous phrase, "form follows function," wasn't just a design rule, it was a challenge. Sullivan argued that buildings should express their purpose through their shape. A bank should look solid. A theater should look inviting. A tall office building should look tall, not like a church or a palace or a column from ancient Rome. Before Sullivan, many American buildings still copied European styles. Architects used heavy ornamentation to signal class or tradition, whether it fit the building's use or not. You might see a post office that looked like a Greek temple, or a department store decked out in Gothic arches. To Sullivan, that approach was dishonest. It didn't reflect the reality of modern life. America was becoming something new. Its architecture needed to reflect that change. Sullivan trained at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and worked for a time in Philadelphia, but it was in Chicago that he made his mark. The city, still recovering from the fire of 1871, was a blank canvas. The demand for new construction was high, and the old rules had been swept away. Here, Sullivan found the freedom to test his ideas. He partnered with engineer Dankmar Adler, who brought structural and acoustic expertise to the table. Together, they created buildings that were both functional and expressive. One of their earliest successes was the Auditorium Building in Chicago. Finished in 1889, it was massive for its time, housing a theater, offices, and a hotel under one roof. Adler made sure the acoustics worked and the structure was sound. Sullivan focused on how the building looked and felt. The facade used ornament, but not in a way that copied the past. Instead, the decoration grew out of the building's structure, almost like vines from a wall. Inside, the design flowed from space to space with logic and grace. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. But it was in office buildings that Sullivan's ideas reached their peak. In works like the Wainwright Building in St. Louis or the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, he created a new visual language for tall buildings. He treated the skyscraper like a column: base, shaft, and capital. The ground floor was open and accessible for shops and entrances. The middle section repeated office floors in clean vertical lines. The top had a flourish, not classical in style, but organic, almost botanical. It gave the building a sense of completion without relying on historical cliches. These buildings weren't just efficient, they were honest. You could tell what they were for. They didn't try to hide behind styles from another age. That was the core of Sullivan's philosophy. He believed that a building's purpose should shape its appearance, and that this would create beauty. Not beauty for its own sake, but beauty rooted in truth. That belief set him apart in a time when many architects were still looking backward. Sullivan's use of ornament is sometimes misunderstood. He didn't reject decoration entirely. What he opposed was meaningless decoration, patterns slapped onto buildings without connection to their structure or function. When he did use ornament, it was detailed, flowing, and usually abstract. He took inspiration from nature, especially plant forms, and used them in stylized ways. These designs were integrated into the building, not applied after the fact. They reinforced his larger point, that beauty comes from within. In this way, Sullivan bridged the gap between tradition and modernity. He didn't strip buildings bare. He didn't say that aesthetics didn't matter. He said they had to grow from the building's core purpose. That made his work deeply modern, even though it still had curves, patterns, and texture. He showed that function and form could work together without one overpowering the other. Sullivan's influence was greatest on the next generation. One of his early draftsmen was Frank Lloyd Wright, who would go on to become America's most famous architect. Wright absorbed Sullivan's lessons about honesty in design and the importance of connecting form to function. He also learned from Sullivan's struggles. As architectural taste shifted toward more European-influenced styles at the turn of the century, Sullivan found himself out of step. Commissions slowed. His firm broke up. He spent his final years in relative obscurity, writing about architecture more than building it. But his ideas didn't die. They lingered in the minds of architects and thinkers, especially as modernism took hold in the early 20th century. As steel and glass towers became common, Sullivan's call for integrity in design echoed in the work of later architects. Even if they didn't follow his visual style, they took his message seriously. The best buildings, they believed, weren't just functional. They also communicated something about their purpose and their time. Chicago, in particular, carries Sullivan's fingerprints. His buildings still stand, though some have been lost. They're not the tallest anymore. They don't scream for attention, but they show a depth of thought that continues to matter. They remind us that skyscrapers aren't just engineering feats. They're cultural expressions. They reflect choices about what matters, what should last, and how cities see themselves. What Sullivan brought to the skyscraper wasn't a technique, it was a point of view. He treated buildings not as backdrops, but as participants in the life of the city. He asked hard questions. Why build this? Who is it for? What should it say? In answering those questions, he gave American architecture a new direction. Not one that rejected the past entirely, but one that insisted the present deserved its own voice. And that voice, for Sullivan, came from the inside out. While Chicago laid the foundation for the skyscraper with function-driven design, New York took a different route. In Manhattan, height wasn't just about solving space constraints, it became a form of communication. The city's most iconic skyscrapers didn't hide their purpose in plain steel frames. Instead, they dressed it in stone, terracotta, and gleaming metal. Buildings like the Woolworth and Chrysler didn't just rise, they performed. They used historical references, intricate detail, and bold silhouettes to tell stories about ambition, identity, and power. The Woolworth Building, completed in 1913, is a clear example. At nearly 800 feet tall, it was the tallest building in the world at the time. But what truly set it apart was its look. Designed by Cass Gilbert, it used neo-Gothic styling, a reference to medieval cathedrals. This was a conscious choice. Frank Woolworth, the retail magnate behind the building, wanted something grand, something that would symbolize the strength and permanence of his growing empire. So Gilbert wrapped the steel frame in ornate Gothic decoration, pointed arches, carved tracery, flying buttresses. The building looked like a skyscraper that had grown out of Europe's architectural past. It blended old forms with new function. This was not a rejection of modernity. It was a reframing of it. The building used all the latest materials and technologies, elevators, reinforced concrete, high-speed construction techniques, but its appearance grounded it in a long tradition of monumental architecture. It gave people a sense of familiarity while still astonishing them with scale. For New York, this became a pattern. Its skyscrapers didn't erase history, they staged it. Then came the Chrysler Building, completed in 1930. Where the Woolworth had looked to Gothic cathedrals, the Chrysler looked to the future. It embraced Art Deco, a style known for its geometric patterns, machine-inspired motifs, and luxurious materials. Architect William Van Allen created a building that looked like movement frozen in metal. Its terraced crown of radiating arches, made of stainless steel, caught the light in a way that made the whole structure seem alive. The spire, secretly assembled inside and then hoisted into place, secured the building's title as the world's tallest for a few brief months. Every part of the Chrysler Building told a story about the auto industry and its glamour. The corners of the upper floors featured stylized eagles, modeled after Chrysler hood ornaments. The entrance lobby shimmered with African marble and chrome accents. It wasn't just a building, it was branding in 3 dimensions. Walter Chrysler didn't fund the tower as an office building alone. He saw it as a statement. It said that American industry was fast, modern, and elegant. It said that height wasn't just an engineering goal, it was a symbol of dominance. This was a distinctly New York approach to skyscrapers. The city didn't view ornament as a distraction from function. It saw it as part of the function. Buildings weren't only places to work, they were visual landmarks, cultural symbols, even psychological tools. In a dense, competitive environment, a building's appearance could shape how people viewed a company, a neighborhood, or the city itself. Form became narrative, texture became identity. The Empire State Building, which followed the Chrysler by a year, was more restrained in detail, but no less theatrical in scale. Its spire, originally designed as a mooring mast for airships, gave it a dramatic silhouette, even though the airship plan never worked. Its streamlined, setback profile followed the 1916 zoning laws, which required tall buildings to recede as they rose. But it also gave the building a sense of motion and grace. The setbacks weren't just regulatory, they became stylistic. In New York, even rules became design features. This focus on ornament wasn't just about decoration, it helped buildings respond to the emotional climate of the times. During the Great Depression, these towers became symbols of hope and perseverance. They projected strength when the economy was weak. Their bold forms offered reassurance that the city and the nation still believed in progress. They turned architecture into messaging. New York's commitment to storytelling through buildings also came from its mix of influences. Immigrant architects, developers, and craftsmen brought styles from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The city had always been a mosaic. Its skyline became one too. You could find Egyptian obelisks, Roman columns, Gothic arches, and Deco zigzags, all within a few blocks. This eclecticism wasn't chaos, it was character. And skyscrapers, more than any other form, captured that layered, theatrical identity. It's important to understand that these choices weren't purely aesthetic. They had practical effects. Ornamental features helped break up large surfaces and scale down massive structures. They gave pedestrians something to engage with. At ground level, carvings, canopies, and metalwork invited people in. At the top, spires and crowns helped mark the skyline from a distance. These weren't superficial gestures. They created orientation, rhythm, and legibility in a city constantly in motion. The contrast with Chicago is striking. Where Chicago sought clarity and structure, New York embraced spectacle and texture. Where Chicago's Sullivan said form follows function, New York's towers seemed to say form tells a story. These weren't contradictory values. They reflected different urban contexts. Chicago had space to grow out. New York had to grow up and sell itself in the process. That pressure to be visible, memorable, and iconic turned New York into a laboratory for visual expression. The skyline became competitive. Buildings didn't just exist next to one another, they tried to outdo one another. This led to a kind of vertical theater. Every new tower needed a signature. Sometimes it was a spire, Sometimes it was a decorative crown. Sometimes it was simply the use of rich materials, stone, bronze, glass in varied patterns and finishes. Even today, the legacy of that ornamental power continues. New York still debates its skyline. Every new proposal gets measured against the Chrysler, the Empire State, and the rest. Not just in terms of height, but in terms of character. Does it say something? Does it add to the story? That's the standard. Not just build tall, but build meaningfully. New York didn't reject modern building methods. It embraced them, but it used them in service of image, identity, and emotion. In doing so, it created more than just real estate. It created landmarks. It didn't just stretch upward, it told the world what the future could look like. Raymond Hood didn't fit neatly into one category. He wasn't a strict modernist, nor was he stuck in the past. He stood between styles, bridging tradition and innovation at a time when American cities were growing taller and denser. Hood had a special ability. He could translate the technical needs of skyscrapers into expressive, coherent forms that felt fresh but also familiar. His buildings showed how architecture could meet zoning rules, serve practical needs, and still stand out visually. In doing so, he became a key figure in shaping New York City's skyline. Hood's early recognition came from Chicago. In 1922, he won the Chicago Tribune Tower competition, one of the most publicized architectural contests of the time. His design, created with John Mead Howells, used a soaring neo-Gothic form, layered with detail and vertical energy. It didn't shy away from decoration, but it also didn't rely on historical accuracy. Instead, it used Gothic ideas to enhance the building's verticality, giving the structure an unmistakable presence without feeling outdated. The Tribune Tower project earned him national attention and proved he could balance popular taste with architectural innovation. Despite his win in Chicago, it was New York that became Hood's main stage. He understood the city's hunger for bold forms that could capture attention and reflect power. He also understood the new zoning laws that shaped how tall buildings could rise. New York's 1916 zoning resolution required setbacks. The higher a building went, the more it had to pull away from the street to let sunlight reach ground level. Many architects saw this as a limitation. Hood saw it as an opportunity. His design for the American Radiator Building in 1924 brought that idea to life. Located on Bryant Park, the tower was striking for several reasons. Its dark brick facade was almost black, highly unusual at the time, and it was accented with gold-colored bricks and metal details. The building didn't just comply with setback rules, it dramatized them. Each tier stepped back in a way that emphasized height and rhythm. At night, the building was lit from below, turning it into a glowing silhouette against the skyline. It was practical and poetic at once. The structure housed office space, but it also projected strength and mystery. It showed that a utility company, like American Radiator, could present itself with the confidence and glamour usually reserved for banks or government buildings. Hood didn't stick to one style. He adapted. In the 1930s, he played a central role in the design of Rockefeller Center, one of the most ambitious urban developments in the city's history. The complex included multiple buildings, public spaces, and underground corridors. It had to be both monumental and functional, beautiful and flexible. Hood, working with a team of architects, helped shape its overall form. He was instrumental in organizing the buildings around plazas and passageways, creating flow between private and public space. What made Rockefeller Center special was its careful coordination. The central tower, 30 Rockefeller Plaza, used the zoning setbacks to climb upward in sculpted stages. The massing gave the building a strong sense of order. It didn't just rise, it unfolded. Its Art Deco detailing was elegant but restrained. Hood's influence can be seen in how every surface feels intentional, every transition measured. He didn't treat zoning laws as boxes to check. He turned them into design tools. Even in his more modest buildings, Hood paid close attention to proportion, silhouette, and surface. He believed that architecture should speak clearly to the public. He once said that buildings should be a relief from the coldness of the machine. He wasn't against modern techniques or mass production, he used them, but he didn't believe that efficiency alone could make a good building. There had to be something more. A gesture, a rhythm, a material choice that made the structure human. One reason Hood could balance these elements was his training. He studied at MIT and later at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The Beaux-Arts system emphasized clarity, hierarchy, and the importance of making buildings legible to the public. That education gave him the tools to navigate between modern and traditional forms. He didn't dismiss classical ideas, he reinterpreted them. He used symmetry when it helped organize space. He used ornament when it served the building's purpose. But he was never locked into any one way of doing things. In a city filled with architects chasing trends, Hood stood out by staying grounded. He avoided extreme gestures. His work didn't scream for attention, but it always held your gaze. That quiet confidence gave his buildings lasting appeal. Many of them are still in use, still admired, still studied. He also worked on the Daily News building, completed in 1930. This was another example of how he adapted form to function. The building's sleek facade featured vertical window bands that emphasized height without relying on classical references. The interior lobby contained a massive globe, giving visitors a literal map of the world. It was functional, but it also reinforced the building's identity as a center for news and information. The design felt modern without being cold. Hood didn't chase novelty for its own sake. He focused on making spaces that worked and left an impression. His ability to shift styles while keeping a consistent approach made him unique. Whether he was working in neo-Gothic, Art Deco, or stripped-down modern, his work was grounded in logic and visual discipline. He responded to each project's context, program, and constraints, rather than forcing a signature look onto every site. That flexibility made him valuable in a city that was always changing. Raymond Hood's legacy isn't defined by a single building or style. It's defined by a way of thinking, responsive, structured, and visually aware. He believed that buildings could be both rational and expressive, both efficient and graceful. He showed that style didn't have to be rigid, and that rules like zoning laws didn't have to limit creativity. They could shape it. He didn't leave behind a school or a manifesto, but his work left a clear trace in how New York evolved. It reminded architects that form could follow function without being dull, and that ornament could have purpose without being excessive. Hood didn't just build skyscrapers, he helped define what they could mean. In 1922, the Chicago Tribune announced an open competition for the design of its new headquarters. The goal was clear: to create the most beautiful office building in the world. This challenge drew entries from across the globe, 260 in total, and quickly became one of the most talked-about architectural events of the early 20th century. But beyond the public excitement, the competition revealed a deep split in architectural thinking. It exposed a critical moment where modernism and revivalism met head-on. What emerged was not just a building, but a turning point. The Tribune Tower competition offered a large cash prize, which attracted both well-known architects and rising talents. The winning design came from New York-based architects John Mead Howells and Raymond Hood. Their neo-Gothic entry was dramatic and ornate. It used flying buttresses, a tall crown, and detailed stone carving. At first glance, it looked like something out of medieval Europe. But it wasn't just a copy of the past. Hood and Howells understood the verticality and scale of the modern skyscraper, and they combined that with old-world symbolism. The design made an impact because it was familiar and monumental. It looked like a tower of authority, exactly what the Tribune wanted to communicate. But the real shock of the competition came not from the winner, but from a design that placed second. Eliel Saarinen, a Finnish architect, submitted a tower that was completely different. His entry was tall, clean, and stripped of historical ornament. The base flared outward slightly. The shaft rose with continuous vertical lines, unbroken by decoration. The top tapered in a smooth, restrained way. There were no Gothic arches or carved angels, just simple massing and proportion. It looked like a machine-built temple to modernity. Saarinen's design was quiet compared to the Gothic towers that surrounded it in the exhibition hall. But for many architects who saw it, especially younger ones, it represented the future. Instead of reaching into the past for meaning, Saarinen focused on the building's form, structure, and rhythm. It didn't tell stories with statues or decorative flourishes. It spoke through its shape and its logic. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about progress. Even though it didn't win, Saarinen's design had lasting influence. Raymond Hood himself later said that Saarinen's entry was the best in the competition. Other architects, including those involved in the growing modernist movement in Europe and the United States, took note. The design foreshadowed the international style, a movement that would soon dominate architecture in the decades to come. The international style valued simplicity, functionalism, and clarity. It favored steel, glass, and concrete over stone or terracotta. Saarinen's work fit that emerging approach. It looked ahead, while many other entries looked back. In this sense, the Tribune Tower competition became more than a contest. It became a fork in the road. On one side was historic revivalism, a method that used the language of the past to express power and tradition. On the other side was modernism, which aimed to find new expressions rooted in current needs and technologies. Hood and Howells won the job, and their design still stands on Michigan Avenue. But Saarinen's second-place design quietly won the future. That split wasn't just aesthetic. It also reflected changing values in society. In the early 20th century, cities were growing fast. Technology was transforming how people lived and worked. Steel frames, elevators, and electric lighting had changed what buildings could do. Architects were beginning to ask whether the styles of old Europe were still appropriate in this new world. Did a newspaper building really need to look like a cathedral? Did a skyscraper need decoration at all? Saarinen's design didn't just answer those questions, it reframed them. His entry was also a clear example of how architecture could reflect honesty in structure. Instead of disguising the building's height with historical detail, he embraced it. The form expressed the function. The materials and lines reflected the building's structure. In this way, Saarinen aligned with thinkers like Louis Sullivan, who had argued that form follows function. But Saarinen's work went further. It removed almost all symbolic reference. It focused on clarity, balance, and proportion alone. New York architects paid close attention. The city was on the brink of a new phase in skyscraper design. Zoning laws required setbacks, which created buildings with tiered, geometric shapes. Architects had to find ways to make these new shapes look graceful and coherent. Saarinen's design offered a model. It showed that a tower could be beautiful without being dressed up. This influence showed up in later New York towers like the Daily News Building and Rockefeller Center. These buildings didn't copy Saarinen, but they carried the spirit of his clarity. At the same time, the competition highlighted how public taste and professional opinion didn't always align. The judges, and likely the Tribune's leadership, favored a building that looked strong and classical. They wanted a landmark that the public would recognize and respect. Gothic ornament offered that. It had weight. It had history. But architects and critics saw something deeper in Saarinen's entry. They saw the beginning of a new kind of beauty, one that came not from style, but from substance. That debate continues in architecture today. The question of how much history to carry forward and how much to leave behind is never fully settled. But the Tribune Tower competition marked one of the first times that split was clearly visible. It put modernism on display before it had fully arrived. It gave the world a glimpse of where design could go, and in many ways, where it was already going. Saarinen didn't get the commission, but his quiet, powerful design reshaped architectural thinking. It traveled through sketches, lectures, and journals. It showed what could happen when a building was allowed to express itself through logic instead of legend. It challenged architects to look forward, not backward. And even though it didn't win the prize, it changed the rules of the game. In the late 1920s, New York City became the center of a strange and symbolic battle. Developers and architects weren't just constructing buildings, they were racing. They weren't competing for tenants or leases. They were fighting for height. For a brief but intense period, being the tallest building in the world became a form of status. It was about who could reach the sky first and stay there the longest. The era produced three of the most iconic buildings in the city: 40 Wall Street, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building. Each structure marked a step in the race, and each one turned verticality into a weapon of prestige. The contest began with 40 Wall Street. Built by the Bank of Manhattan Trust Company, it was designed by architect H. Craig Severance. Severance had once worked closely with William Van Allen, the architect of the Chrysler Building, but they had become bitter rivals. Their competition added personal fuel to an already high-stakes race. 40 Wall Street was planned to rise 927 feet, taller than the Eiffel Tower and taller than any building in the world at that time. When it topped out in April 1930, its developers claimed victory. They said the world's tallest title now belonged to Lower Manhattan. But the celebration didn't last. Just a few months later, across town, Van Allen unveiled the final secret of the Chrysler Building. For most of its construction, the Chrysler Building appeared to be shorter than 40 Wall Street. Van Allen, however, had kept a surprise hidden inside the top of the tower, a 125-foot spire assembled in sections and raised into place in just 90 minutes. With this dramatic move, the Chrysler Building soared to 1,046 feet, overtaking its rival without warning. Van Allen had outsmarted Severance. It wasn't just engineering, it was theater. The Chrysler Building's win was dramatic, but its reign was short. Even as it took the record, another challenger was already rising. Just blocks away on Fifth Avenue, construction had begun on the Empire State Building. Developed by former General Motors executive John J. Raskob and former New York Governor Al Smith, the project was meant to be more than just tall. It was meant to be definitive. The design team, led by the firm Shreve, Lamb & Harmon, knew they were entering a crowded field, so they went higher, much higher. Originally planned to reach about 1,150 feet, the Empire State Building's height was revised several times during design. Each revision pushed the building farther above its rivals. When it was completed in 1931, it reached 1,250 feet to the top of its roof and 1,454 feet, including the antenna added later. It wasn't just taller than the Chrysler Building, it eclipsed it. The title of world's tallest wasn't just taken, it was locked in. The Empire State Building would hold it for nearly 4 decades. This height race wasn't only about numbers, it reflected the mood of the era. The late 1920s were full of ambition and speculation. Skyscrapers became symbols of that spirit. They didn't just provide space, they showed confidence. To many people, height meant progress. It showed that New York wasn't afraid to rise. But when the stock market crashed in 1929, that message shifted. The Empire State Building opened in 1931 in the depths of the Great Depression. Much of its space sat empty. People called it the Empty State Building. It was a towering monument to a dream that had suddenly collapsed. Still, it stood, and over time, it filled. The building became a beacon. Its height took on new meaning. It wasn't just a record anymore. It was a reminder that bold action could outlast hard times. Tourists came to the observation deck. Films, photographs, and postcards turned it into an icon. The building's clean Art Deco lines and towering antenna became shorthand for New York itself. Even if it was built for a different moment, it found its place. What's important about this rivalry is that it wasn't about necessity. These buildings weren't made taller because they had to be. They were made taller because their creators wanted to send a message. They used steel and stone to say something abstract. They were competing for attention, not just space. In a crowded skyline, being the tallest made you visible. It gave you presence. It placed you in headlines and history. The designs reflected that purpose. The Chrysler Building, with its metallic crown and spire, didn't just reach upward, it shimmered. It looked like movement. The Empire State Building, on the other hand, was more straightforward. Its setbacks gave it a tiered silhouette that looked strong and balanced. It didn't play tricks. It didn't need to. Its sheer size did the work. Each building also made different choices about how to engage with the city below. 40 Wall Street was sleek, but had little to offer pedestrians. The Chrysler Building had a dramatic lobby, filled with marble and mural art, but its focus was mostly upward. The Empire State Building, despite its scale, worked hard to be part of the street. It offered storefronts, a grand lobby, and wide sidewalks. It was made for public access. Its observation deck turned it into a destination, not just a workplace. All 3 buildings used architecture as a kind of language. They used style, materials, and silhouette to make their claims. They used height to assert dominance. And they did it in full view of each other. This wasn't a slow, anonymous process. It was a back and forth, a visible race played out in steel beams and construction cranes. The public followed along in newspapers and magazines. Everyone had a favorite. Everyone watched the skyline change. That energy shaped how skyscrapers were understood for decades. After this period, height alone became a major goal in cities around the world. Engineers refined techniques, developers looked for records, but few races had the symbolic weight of the one in New York. This was about more than construction. It was about proving something, about architecture, about ambition, about the city itself. In that brief window between 1928 and 1931, New York didn't just build tall buildings, it created a myth. The city became the place where records were broken, where drama unfolded in steel and stone. The skyline became a scoreboard, and for a time, height was the measure of greatness. The skyscraper rivalry between New York and Chicago was never as simple as a clean split between styles or regions. While the cities competed to build higher and capture attention, the people shaping their skylines often moved freely between them. Architects, engineers, draftsmen, and theorists shared ideas, changed addresses, and brought lessons from one city to another. This movement of talent didn't just blur the line between East Coast drama and Midwest function. It created a new kind of American skyscraper, one that was both technically advanced and visually ambitious. Raymond Hood is a clear example. Born in Rhode Island and trained at MIT and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, Hood had no permanent allegiance to a single city. After winning the 1922 Chicago Tribune Tower competition, a major event hosted in Chicago, he went on to leave his biggest mark on New York. His ability to take the Gothic ideas praised in that Chicago project and adapt them to the zoning-driven, commercial needs of Manhattan buildings showed just how flexible design could be when informed by multiple influences. The Tribune Tower itself, although built in Chicago, sparked national debate about what modern skyscrapers should look like. Its impact traveled far beyond its own footprint. That competition and others like it became engines for idea sharing. Even architects who didn't win or build in one city still shaped its conversation. Eliel Saarinen's second-place entry for the Tribune Tower wasn't built, but its clean, tapered massing and lack of historic ornament heavily influenced New York designers. It encouraged a turn towards simplified, expressive forms, early signs of the international style. These quiet shifts in aesthetics and proportion echoed between cities in professional journals, sketchbooks, and classroom lectures. Frank Lloyd Wright, though mostly associated with low-rise homes and organic architecture, spent time working in Chicago and maintained relationships with New York figures. Louis Sullivan, Wright's mentor and one of the founding voices of modern American architecture, built his legacy in Chicago but published his ideas nationally. His essays about form, function, and architectural honesty reached students and practitioners in both cities. Many who read Sullivan's work would go on to teach or build in New York, filtering his Midwestern values through the lens of East Coast density and commercialism. The cross-pollination wasn't limited to well-known names. Many lesser-known draftsmen and designers also moved between firms in Chicago and New York, taking job offers where they came, often following new commissions or development booms. These were the people who translated zoning laws into facade patterns, who balanced elevator shaft dimensions with rentable floor space, and who made hundreds of aesthetic decisions in response to practical demands. Their shared skills built a common language of materials and methods. Engineering firms also worked across both cities. The structural challenges of building tall, especially as buildings surpassed 50, 60, even 80 stories, required specific technical expertise. Whether solving for wind loads, elevator stacking, or steel connections, engineers consulted each other across state lines. Chicago engineers introduced ideas like the bundled tube structure in the 1960s, a technique that allowed for lighter, stiffer buildings. Though first implemented in Chicago, its logic influenced high-rise development globally, including in New York. Even the differences between cities led to shared solutions. Chicago, with its wide streets and flat terrain, allowed for more horizontal planning. New York, cramped and vertical, demanded different responses. But when firms worked in both contexts, they had to adapt. A setback tower might make sense in New York because of sunlight ordinances, but the idea of tiered massing also found its way into later Chicago buildings, not as a zoning requirement, but as a stylistic and environmental strategy. Conversely, Chicago's focus on efficient structure and floor plate design influenced how New York developers planned rentable space. Professional organizations helped this exchange as well. The American Institute of Architects held national conventions and circulated journals that published new designs and construction details. Universities such as Columbia in New York and the University of Illinois in Chicago trained young architects who would graduate into jobs in either city. Many students interned in one place and started their careers in the other. The architectural press, too, played a role. Magazines like Architectural Record and The Western Architect regularly featured buildings from both cities, placing them side by side for comparison and critique. Developers themselves also encouraged this exchange. They often hired architects from outside their home city to bring in fresh ideas. A New York developer might hire a Chicago engineer to solve a structural issue. A Chicago businessman might hire a New York architect to give their building more visibility. These decisions weren't always about aesthetics. They were often about marketing. A building that looked a little different could command higher rents or draw more press coverage. By the 1930s, the effects of this talent exchange were visible in the skyline itself. New York's buildings had begun to blend Chicago's structural clarity with their own love of theatrical detail. The Daily News building, for example, designed by Raymond Hood in New York, shows this mix clearly. Its vertical lines and setbacks reflect zoning requirements, but its clean surface treatment and rational organization of space reflect Chicago's influence. It was a skyscraper that looked like it belonged to both cities at once. This back and forth continued into the post-war years. As cities expanded outward and upward, the definition of a modern skyscraper became less about geography and more about shared values: efficiency, clarity, presence, and adaptability. A tall building in Houston or Los Angeles might now draw from both the steel frame logic of early Chicago and the expressive surface treatments of Art Deco New York. The regional flavor remained, but the DNA had been scrambled. What started as a rivalry turned into a conversation. The sharp contrast between Chicago's plain-spoken structures and New York's stylized towers began to fade. In its place was something more flexible, a hybrid skyscraper, one that could be both bold and rational, decorative and efficient. This wasn't compromise, it was synthesis. What made this possible wasn't just technology or style, it was people. Architects and engineers who moved between cities, bringing with them sketches, critiques, and methods. Builders who learned on one coast and worked on the other. Educators who passed on ideas that had been tested in both markets. These individuals didn't just respond to their environment, they changed it. Their shared work defined the American skyscraper, not just as a structure, but as a message, not just as a height record, but as a statement about how cities should look, feel, and function. The buildings they created still tower over city streets, reminding us that even in competition, ideas travel, and when they do, they often leave something stronger behind. In 1916, New York City passed a zoning resolution that would change the shape of skyscrapers. It didn't set height limits. Instead, it introduced a new rule. As buildings got taller, they had to step back from the street. The higher you went, the smaller your footprint had to become. This law wasn't about style. It was about sunlight. The city had begun to notice the dark canyons forming between tall buildings. When structures rose straight up from the lot line, they cast long shadows and blocked airflow. The new regulation tried to fix that. It forced architects and developers to think differently. The result was the setback aesthetic, a new look that defined New York's skyline for decades. Skyscrapers now rose in stages, creating a series of receding terraces. The form resembled a wedding cake or a mountain. These shapes weren't invented for beauty, they were invented to obey a rule. But once the rule existed, architects found ways to make it work in their favor. Raymond Hood was one of the first to understand that these setbacks could be more than compliance. They could be design. In buildings like the American Radiator Building and the Daily News Building, he used the required form to emphasize vertical rhythm. He made the steps look intentional, not forced. The setbacks didn't interrupt the design, they shaped it. The result was a new kind of urban architecture, sculptural, expressive, and deeply tied to its environment. Other architects followed. Some added terraces or rooftop gardens. Others used the shape to play with shadow and light. The steps gave them visual tools. They broke down the scale of massive buildings, making them feel more human at the street level. Instead of flat walls, passers-by saw depth and variation. Instead of looming blocks, the skyline became a series of rising forms. This zoning rule didn't apply everywhere. It was specific to New York, responding to its unique density and street grid. But the buildings it created became so iconic that the form spread. Even in cities without such laws, architects began to use setbacks. They liked the look. It gave tall buildings a sense of balance and proportion. It also gave them a way to express verticality without monotony. The steps offered rhythm. They gave the eye something to follow upward. The 1916 resolution came at a moment when New York was growing quickly. The subway system had expanded. Office buildings were in high demand. Developers wanted to build as much rentable space as possible. The city wanted to make sure its streets remained livable. The law didn't stop development, it redirected it. Instead of going straight up, buildings had to think in 3 dimensions. The zoning law divided the city into different use areas: residential, commercial, and unrestricted. It also introduced something new, the sky exposure plane. This was an imaginary line that sloped inward from the street. Buildings had to stay behind it. The angle depended on the width of the street. On narrow streets, buildings had to set back sooner. On wide avenues, they could go higher before pulling back. This technical rule created a new design language. Architects began to work with models instead of just drawings. They used clay or cardboard to shape their buildings around the zoning envelope. This made them think differently. Instead of designing a facade, they designed a form. They asked how the building would rise, not just how it would look. The setbacks became a way to unify massing and expression. Developers, at first, saw the law as a burden, but over time, many came to appreciate it. The steps created valuable corner offices. They allowed for rooftop signage. In some cases, they offered legal paths to higher towers. If a developer included public amenities like open space or plazas, they could get extra floor area. This trade-off between public benefit and private gain became a key feature of New York planning. The Chrysler Building is one of the clearest examples of how the setback rule shaped design. Its narrow base rises in stages, each one thinner than the last. The top becomes a crown of steel, reflecting sunlight and capturing attention. The shape follows the law, but it also creates drama. It leads the eye upward and announces itself on the skyline. Without the 1916 law, the building might have been a flat box. Instead, it became a sculptural landmark. Rockefeller Center offers another case. The Central Tower, 30 Rockefeller Plaza, follows the zoning rule exactly. Its setbacks create outdoor terraces and a strong vertical thrust. The building feels grounded but still reaches. Its form is clean and symmetrical, a response to both code and ambition. Around it, the other buildings in the complex follow similar lines. Together, they form a composition that feels deliberate, even though it began as a response to regulation. The setback rule also influenced materials. As buildings stepped back, architects used stone, brick, and metal to emphasize their structure. They highlighted edges, wrapped corners, and added detail at key transitions. The rules gave them a framework. Within it, they found freedom. Over time, the setback look became part of New York's identity. Tourists expected it, movies showed it, artists drew it. The skyline became a cultural symbol. The stepped forms told people where they were. Even as new glass towers began to rise in the late 20th century, the older zoning-era buildings remained central to the city's image. In 1961, New York updated its zoning code. The new version encouraged open plazas and slender towers rather than stepped forms. But the earlier buildings didn't go away. They continued to set the tone, and many architects still returned to their shapes, either out of nostalgia or because the steps simply worked. The 1916 zoning resolution was a technical document. It didn't tell architects how to design. It told them what not to block. But by doing that, it created an aesthetic. It gave shape to ambition. It linked architecture to sunlight and air, to public good and private vision. It showed that rules can lead to beauty, not by accident, but by necessity. And in the hands of the right designers, it turned law into art. The skyscraper rivalry between Chicago and New York wasn't just a matter of height. It was about what those heights represented. Each city built upward for different reasons. Each skyline told a different story. Chicago's towers stood for practicality, resilience, and structure. New York's reached for spectacle, ambition, and dominance. These values shaped not just buildings, but identities, how each city saw itself and how the world saw America. Chicago's identity was shaped by disaster. The Great Fire of 1871 destroyed much of the central city. Rebuilding was urgent, and land was relatively available. This gave Chicago a chance to rethink how buildings could work. Architects and engineers approached the problem with technical focus. They experimented with steel frames, fireproofing, and new construction techniques. The result was a skyline that reflected the spirit of engineering over aesthetics. Buildings were clear, sturdy, and rational. They were built to function first and to impress second. Louis Sullivan, a key figure in Chicago's architectural story, believed that form should follow function. That idea shaped a whole generation of buildings. The goal was to make something honest, something that revealed its structure rather than hiding it behind decoration. Sullivan's office buildings, such as the Wainwright and Guarantee buildings, had clean lines and rhythmic windows. They didn't try to mimic cathedrals or palaces. They looked like what they were, machines for modern work. That directness became part of Chicago's identity. The city saw itself as efficient, industrious, and innovative. New York developed under different pressures. Manhattan had limited space and intense competition. Land was expensive, and developers needed to make every square foot count. Height wasn't just possible, it was necessary. But it wasn't only about fitting more people into a small area. It was also about showing off. New York's towers weren't just about use. They were about image. Each new skyscraper tried to outdo the last, not just in size, but in drama. This drive for attention led to buildings that were theatrical, ornate, and symbolic. The Woolworth Building used Gothic forms to declare its strength. The Chrysler Building used Art Deco metalwork to shimmer like a machine-age monument. The Empire State Building stood as a raw display of ambition, finished during the depths of the Great Depression. These weren't just places to work. They were advertisements for wealth, power, and speed. They turned architecture into a kind of vertical storytelling. Chicago's towers, by contrast, stayed grounded in logic. Even when buildings reached new heights, they did so with structural clarity. The Willis Tower, formerly Sears Tower, built in the 1970s, used a bundled tube system, an engineering solution that allowed for both height and efficiency. The building's form followed its internal structure. Its look came from how it stood, not from how it wanted to be seen. It was designed by engineer Fazlur Rahman Khan, not a traditional architect. That says a lot about the Chicago mindset. First, solve the problem, then shape the space. New York didn't ignore structure, but it focused more on presence. Its skyline became a brand. It symbolized modernity, aspiration, and capital. When immigrants arrived in the early 20th century, they saw a forest of towers rising behind the Statue of Liberty. To them, the skyline meant possibility. The image of Manhattan rising out of the water became a global icon. It didn't matter whether people knew the names of the buildings. The shapes alone carried meaning. They said, "This is where the future happens." Chicago's skyline worked differently. It wasn't a single wall of buildings along the river. It was more spread out, more open. It revealed its towers slowly, often framed by parks and lakefront. The emphasis wasn't on density, but on structure. Visitors were drawn to the clarity of its lines, the logic of its layout. Architecture tours in Chicago often focused on materials, engineering breakthroughs, and construction techniques. In New York, they focused on drama, history, and style. The skylines also reflected their economic base. Chicago was tied to manufacturing, transport, and trade. Its buildings housed companies that needed reliability and space. The designs reflected that need. New York was the center of finance, media, and advertising. Its buildings didn't just hold people, they projected image. Developers there understood the power of silhouette, of having a tower that stood out in photos or newspaper headlines. Visibility meant value. That difference remains. When people describe New York's skyline, they use words like iconic, cinematic, legendary. When they describe Chicago's, they talk about clarity, innovation, and structure. Both skylines are respected, but they serve different emotional functions. One dazzles, the other explains. This doesn't mean Chicago lacked beauty or that New York lacked depth. Chicago has Art Deco gems and expressive modern towers. New York has buildings that are elegantly restrained, but their skylines developed under different pressures and priorities. Those choices shaped how each city expressed itself. Even today, new buildings in both cities carry the weight of those earlier decisions. In Chicago, new towers are judged on how they handle structure, how they fit into the grid, how they use materials. In New York, people ask how a building reshapes the skyline, what its top looks like, whether it can hold its own against the Empire State and Chrysler buildings. The skyscraper rivalry is no longer a direct competition. Other cities, Shanghai, Dubai, Kuala Lumpur, now dominate the height race. But New York and Chicago remain essential to the story because they defined what a skyscraper could be. They gave the form its first meaning. And that meaning was always about more than steel or concrete. It was about values. Chicago built for use. New York built for recognition. Chicago aimed for structure. New York aimed for silhouette. Chicago wanted to solve problems. New York wanted to make statements. These weren't mistakes or accidents. They were choices. And those choices helped define how America saw itself, both at home and abroad. The skyscraper, more than any other building type, captures attention. It's hard to ignore. And in the early 20th century, these towers became the face of modern America. Chicago showed what could be built with discipline and logic. New York showed what could be dreamed with boldness and speed. Both cities reached upward, but they told different stories along the way. The skyscraper rivalry between New York and Chicago defined modern architecture. It gave cities a new way to grow, pushing steel, glass, and concrete higher into the sky. It turned tall buildings into symbols of progress and power. It made city skylines recognizable around the world. But in chasing height and spectacle, both cities left some things behind. The race to touch the sky came with a cost. Human-scale design, public space, and the quality of life at street level were often overlooked or sacrificed. What rose above sometimes cast long shadows below. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the goal was to build taller, faster, and more efficiently. Steel frame construction, elevators, and zoning laws made vertical growth possible. Developers competed to maximize floor area and visibility. Architects looked for ways to make towers stand out. Cities rewarded these efforts with attention and tax revenue, but few asked how these buildings would feel from the sidewalk. As skyscrapers grew, the scale of the street shrank. Early office towers often met the sidewalk with blank walls or oversized lobbies. Their facades didn't relate to people walking by. Entryways were built for scale, not for comfort. Ground floors were treated as pass-through spaces. The goal was to get people inside and upstairs, not to engage them on the sidewalk. Windows were often raised above eye level or shaded by massive overhangs. Corners were sharp, and plazas were barren. People became small next to the buildings meant to serve them. In New York, the 1916 zoning law helped shape buildings into tiered forms, which allowed some light to reach the street. But it didn't fix the problem of disconnected ground-level design. Even beautiful towers like the Chrysler or Empire State focused attention upward. Their setbacks and spires were made to impress from afar, not to enhance street life. The same was true in Chicago. Buildings like the Tribune Tower or the Sears Tower were engineered wonders, but they often turned their backs on the street. The human scale got lost in the vertical rhythm of windows and steel. Open space was another casualty. In the push to build higher, cities often allowed developers to cover entire lots with building mass. Public parks and green spaces were rare near these tall structures. When plazas were required, they were often treated as leftovers, hard surfaces with little shade, few seats, and no real draw for people. These spaces were legal solutions, not social ones. They met the code, but failed to meet human needs. This loss was not invisible. Writers, planners, and residents began to notice. By the mid-20th century, critics like Jane Jacobs pointed out how skyscraper design ignored the life of neighborhoods. Jacobs wrote about the importance of eyes on the street, the idea that safety and vibrancy came from people being present and connected. Tall towers, especially those with isolated entrances and blank walls, broke that connection. They created gaps in the city's fabric. Streets became corridors rather than places to gather. Even inside the buildings, scale changed. Lobbies became oversized, elevators replaced staircases. Natural ventilation and daylight gave way to sealed systems and artificial lighting. Offices became rows of identical rooms stacked high and far from the outdoors. People worked in boxes within boxes. The focus on height and density shaped not just cities but daily life. Workspaces became less varied and more mechanical. The building became a machine, but not always a humane one. Chicago and New York both contributed to this shift. Their architects set global standards for how to design tall buildings. Their engineers found ways to carry massive loads with less material. Their developers showed that towers could turn huge profits. But few of them asked how these buildings shaped culture or how they felt from a bench on the sidewalk. There were exceptions. Some architects looked for ways to reintroduce human scale. Raymond Hood, for example, worked setbacks and material detail into his buildings to make them feel more balanced. The base of the Daily News building included ground-level ornament and clear signage. Later, buildings like Rockefeller Center tried to include public space and cultural uses, but even these efforts were shaped by the logic of vertical growth. As the rivalry pushed forward, modesty became rare. Architects were pressured to create towers that looked new and bold. Subtle buildings got overlooked. Developers wanted attention, and the skyline became a stage for corporate identity. Towers had to be unique. They had to be taller, thinner, shinier. Each new addition to the skyline tried to stand out rather than fit in. The idea of blending into the city, of supporting the street without dominating it, faded. This shift affected how people thought about cities. Young architects learned to focus on elevations and silhouettes. They studied floor area ratios and elevator cores, not stoops and sidewalks. The culture of design tilted upward. Street-level design became a secondary concern. It was something to deal with after the tower had taken shape, not something that shaped the tower from the start. By the 1960s and 70s, this approach began to show cracks. People complained about empty plazas and cold facades. Cities began to lose foot traffic in key areas. In response, urban planners started pushing for change. They introduced incentives for ground-floor retail, shaded walkways, and pedestrian zones. Some cities rewrote their zoning laws to require open space and community amenities. Others created design guidelines to encourage human-scaled materials and features. Still, the legacy of the skyscraper war remained. The focus on height and image left a lasting mark. It changed what people expected from architecture. It taught generations of designers that big was better, that tall was important. It made modesty harder to value. It made local, low-scale development seem like a missed opportunity rather than a valid goal. In many ways, the skyscraper defined 20th century urbanism. It proved that cities could grow without expanding outward. It allowed for density, efficiency, and economic growth. It supported millions of jobs and became a symbol of progress. But it also reshaped cities in ways that didn't always work for everyone. It shifted focus away from the street, away from the sidewalk, away from the people who actually lived there. New York and Chicago helped lead that shift. They gave the world a model. But they also offered a warning. Height alone isn't enough. A building can be tall, beautiful, and efficient, and still fail the city at its feet. Architecture must meet the ground. It must serve the space where people walk, sit, talk, and gather. The best buildings don't just reach for the sky, they remember where they came from.